Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, freedom of self-consciousness, the unhappy consciousness. In skepticism, consciousness truly experiences itself as internally contradictory. From this experience emerges a new form of consciousness, which brings together the two thoughts which skepticism holds apart. Skepticism's lack of thought about itself must vanish, because it is in fact one consciousness which contains within itself these two modes. This new form is therefore one which knows that it is the dual consciousness of itself, as self-liberating, unchangeable and self-identical, and as self-bewildering and self-perverting, and it is the awareness of the self-contradictory nature of itself. In Stoicism, self-consciousness is the simple freedom of itself. In skepticism, this freedom becomes a reality, negates the other side of determinate existence, but really duplicates itself and now knows itself to be a duality. Consequently, the duplication, which formerly was divided between two individuals, the lord and the bondsman, is now lodged in one. The duplication of self-consciousness within itself, which is essential in the notion of spirit, is thus here before us, but not yet in its unity. The unhappy consciousness is the consciousness of self as a dual-natured, merely contradictory being. This unhappy, inwardly disrupted consciousness, since its essentially contradictory nature is for it a single consciousness, must forever have present in the one consciousness the other also, and thus it is driven out of each in turn in the very moment when it imagines it has successfully attained to a peaceful unity with the other. Its true return into itself, or its reconciliation with itself, will, however, display the notion of spirit that has become a living spirit and has achieved an actual existence, because it already possesses as a single undivided consciousness a dual nature. The unhappy consciousness itself is the gazing of one self-consciousness into another, and itself is both, and the unity of both is also its essential nature. But it is not yet explicitly aware that this is its essential nature, or that it is the unity of truth, of both rather. Since it is, to begin with, only the immediate unity of the two, and so takes them to be not the same but opposites, one of them, namely the simple unchangeable, it takes to be the essential being, but the other, the protean changeable, it takes to be the unessential. The two are, for the unhappy consciousness, alien to one another, and because it is itself the consciousness of this contradiction, it identifies itself with the changeable consciousness and takes itself to be the unessential being. But as consciousness of unchangeableness, or of simple essential being, it must at the same time set about freeing itself from the unessential, that is, from itself. For though it indeed takes itself to be merely the changeable, and the unchangeable is for it an alien being, yet it is itself a simple, hence unchangeable consciousness, and hence is aware that this consciousness is its own essence, although in such a way that, again, it does not itself take the essence to be its own. The attitude it assigns to both cannot therefore be one of mutual indifference, that is, it cannot itself be indifferent toward the unchangeable. Rather, it is itself directly both of them, and the relation of the two is for it a relation of essential being to the unessential, so that this latter has to be set aside. But since for it both are equally essential and contradictory, it is merely the contradictory movement in which one opposite does not come to rest in its opposite, but in it only produces itself afresh as an opposite. Here, then, we have a struggle against an enemy, to vanquish whom is really to suffer defeat, where victory in one consciousness is really lost in its opposite, consciousness of life and of existence and activity, is only an agonizing over this existence and activity, for therein it is conscious that its essence is only its opposite, is conscious only of its own nothingness. Raising itself out of this consciousness, it goes over into the unchangeable, but this elevation is itself this same consciousness. It is therefore directly consciousness of the opposite, namely of itself, as a particular individual. The unchangeable that enters into consciousness is through this very fact at the same time affected by individuality, and is only present with the latter, individuality, instead of having been extinguished. In the consciousness of the unchangeable, only continues to arise therefrom. In this movement, however, consciousness experiences just this emergence of individuality in the unchangeable, and of the unchangeable in individuality. Consciousness becomes aware of individuality in general in the unchangeable, and at the same time of its own individuality in the latter. For the truth of this movement is just the oneness of this dual consciousness. This unity, however, in the first instance becomes for it one in which the difference of both is still the dominant feature. Thus there exist for consciousness three different ways in which individuality is linked with the unchangeable. Firstly, it again appears to itself as opposed to the unchangeable, and is thrown back to the beginning of the struggle, which is throughout the element in which the whole relationship subsists. Secondly, consciousness learns that individuality belongs to the unchangeable itself, so that it assumes the form of individuality into which the entire mode of existence passes. Thirdly, it finds its own self as this particular individual in the unchangeable. The first unchangeable it knows only as the alien being who passes judgment on the particular individual. Since secondly, the unchangeable is a form of individuality like itself, consciousness becomes thirdly spirit, and experiences the joy of finding itself therein, and becomes aware of the reconciliation of its individuality with the universal. What is set forth here as the mode of relationship of the unchangeable has appeared as the experience through which the divided self-consciousness passes in its wretchedness. Now this experience, it is true, is not its own one-sided movement, for it is itself the unchangeable consciousness, and this consequently is at the same time a particular individual consciousness too. But the movement is just as much a movement of the unchangeable consciousness, which makes its appearance in that movement as much as the other. For the movement runs through these moments. First, the unchangeable is opposed to individuality in general, and then being itself an individual. It is opposed to another individual, and finally it is one with it. But this reflection, so far as it is made by us, is here premature. For what has come before us so far is only not unchangeableness as unchangeableness of consciousness, which for that reason is not genuine unchangeableness, but one still burdened with an antithesis, not the unchangeable in and for itself. We do not know, therefore, how the latter will behave. Here we know only that for consciousness, which is our object here, the determinations indicated above appear in the unchangeable. For this reason, therefore, the unchangeable consciousness also retains in its vague form the basic character of dividedness and being for self, in contrast to the individual consciousness. Consequently, for the latter, the fact that the unchangeable receives the form of individuality is only a contingent happening, just as it is also merely finds itself opposed to it, so that the relation seems to result from its own nature. That finally it does find itself in the unchangeable appears to it to be brought about partly, no doubt, by itself, or to take place because it is itself an individual. But this unity, both as regards its origin and the fact that it is, appears partly due to the unchangeable, and the antithesis persists within this unity itself. In fact, through the unchangeable's assuming a definite form, the moment of the beyond not only persists, but really is more firmly established. For if the beyond seems to have been brought closer to the individual consciousness through the form of an actuality that is individual, it henceforth on the one hand confronts him as an opaque sensuous unit with all the obstinacy of what is actual. The hope of becoming one with it must remain a hope that is without fulfilment and present fruition, for between the hope and its fulfilment there stands precisely the absolute contingency or inflexible indifference which lies in the very assumption of definite form, which was the ground of hope. By the nature of this immediately present unit, through the actual existence in which it has clothed itself, it necessarily follows that in the world of time it has vanished, and that in space it had remote existence and remains utterly remote. If, at first, the mere notion of the divided consciousness was characterized by the effort to set aside its particular individuality and to become the unchangeable consciousness, its efforts from now on are directed rather to setting aside its relation with the pure formless unchangeable, and to coming into relation only with the unchangeable in its embodied or incarnate form. For the oneness of the particular individual with the unchangeable is henceforth the essence and the object for the consciousness, just as in the mere notion of the formless abstract unchangeable was the just as in the mere notion of it, the formless abstract unchangeable was the essential object, and the relation of this absolute dividedness of the notion is now what it has to turn away from. The initially external relation to the incarnate unchangeable as an alien reality has to be transformed into a relation in which it becomes absolutely one with it. The movement in which the unessential consciousness strives to attain this oneness is itself threefold in accordance with the threefold relation this consciousness will have with its incarnate beyond. First, as pure consciousness, second, as a particular individual who approaches the actual world in the form of desire and work, and third, as consciousness that is aware of its own being for self. We have now to see how these three modes of its being are present and determined in that general relationship. At first, then, this consciousness being taken as pure consciousness, the incarnate unchangeable when it is an object for pure consciousness, seems to be present in its own proper nature. But this is its own proper nature, has not yet come into existence. As we have already remarked, in order that it should appear in consciousness in its own proper nature, this would certainly have to come about from its side rather than from the side of consciousness. Thus, its presence here is, at first, only one-sidedly due to consciousness, and just for that reason is not perfect and genuine, but remains burdened with imperfection or an antithesis. But although this unhappy consciousness does not have the enjoyment of this presence, it has at the same time advanced beyond pure thinking insofar as this is the abstract thinking of Stoicism, which turns its back on individuality altogether, and beyond the merely unsettled thinking of skepticism, which is in fact only individuality in the form of an unconscious contradiction and ceaseless movement. It has advanced beyond both of these. It brings and holds together pure thinking and particular individuality, but has not yet risen to that thinking where consciousness as a particular individuality is reconciled with pure thought itself. It occupies rather this intermediate position where abstract thinking is in contact with the individuality of consciousness qua individuality. The unhappy consciousness is this contact. It is the unity of pure thinking and individuality. Also, it knows itself to be this thinking individuality or pure thinking, and knows the unchangeable itself essentially as an individuality, but what it does not know is that this is its object, the unchangeable, which it knows essentially in the form of individuality, is its own self, is itself the individuality of consciousness. In the first mode, therefore, where we consider it as pure consciousness, it does not relate itself as a thinking consciousness to its object, but though it is indeed in itself or implicitly a pure thinking individuality, and its object is just this pure thinking, although the relating of one to the other is not itself pure thinking, it is only a movement towards thinking, and so is devotion. Its thinking is as such is no more than the chaotic jingling of bells or the mist of warm incense, a musical thinking that does not get as far as the notion, which would be the sole immanent objective mode of thought. This infinite pure inner feeling does indeed come into possession of its object, but this does not make its appearance in conceptual form, not as something speculatively comprehended, and appears therefore as something alien. What we have here then is the inward movement of the pure heart, which feels itself, but itself is agonizingly self-divided, the movement of an infinite yearning, which is certain that its essence is such a pure heart, a pure thinking, which thinks of itself as a particular individuality, certain of being known and recognized by this object, precisely because the latter thinks of itself as an individuality. At the same time, however, The essence is the unattainable beyond, which, in being laid hold of, flees, or rather has already flown. Has already flown, for it is in part the unchangeable, which thinks of itself as an individuality, and consciousness therefore directly attains in its own self, but as the antithesis of the unchangeable, instead of laying hold of the essence, it only feels it and has fallen back into itself. Since, in attaining itself, consciousness is unable to get away from itself as this antithesis to the unchangeable, it has, instead of laying hold of the essence, only laid hold of what is unessential, just as, on the one hand, when striving to find itself in the essence, it takes hold only of its own separate existence, so, on the other hand, it cannot lay hold of the other as an individual or as an actual being. Where that other is sought, it cannot be found, for it is supposed to be just a beyond, something that can not be found. When sought as a particular individual, it is not a universal individuality in the form of thought, not a notion, but an individual in the form of an object, or an actual individual, an object of immediate assent certainly, and for that very reason only something that has already vanished. Consciousness therefore can only find as a present reality the grave of its life, but because this grave is itself an actual existence, and it is contrary to the nature of what actually exists, to afford a lasting possession, the presence of that grave too is merely the struggle of an enterprise doomed to failure. But having learned from experience that the grave of its actual unchangeable being has no actuality, that the vanished individuality, because it has vanished, is not the true individuality, consciousness will abandon its quest for the unchangeable individuality as an actual existence, or will stop trying to hold onto what has vanished. Only then is it capable of finding individuality in its genuine or universal form. But in the first instance, the return of the feeling heart into itself is to be taken to mean that it has an actual existence as an individual. It is the pure heart which for us or in itself has found itself and is inwardly satiated, for although for itself in its feeling the essential being is separated from it, yet this feeling is in itself a feeling of self. It has felt the object of its pure feeling, and this object is itself. Thus it comes forward here as self-feeling or as an actual consciousness existing on its own account. In this return into self, there comes to view its second relationship, that of desire and work, in which consciousness finds confirmation of that inner certainty of itself, which we know it has attained, by overcoming and enjoying the existence alien to it, viz. Existence in the form of independent things, but the unhappy consciousness merely finds itself desiring and working. It is not aware that to find itself active in this way implies that it is in fact certain of itself, and that its feeling of the alien existence is the self-feeling. Since it is not explicitly aware of this certainty, its inner life really remains a still incomplete self-certainty. That confirmation which it would receive through work and enjoyment is therefore equally incomplete. In other words, it must itself set at naught this confirmation, so that it may indeed find in it confirmation, but only confirmation of what it is for itself, namely of its dividedness. The world of actuality to which desire and work are directed is no longer for this consciousness something intrinsically null, something merely to be set aside and consumed, but something like that consciousness itself, an actuality broken in two, which is only from the one aspect intrinsically null, but from another aspect is also a sanctified world. It is the form of the unchangeable, for this has retained individuality, and because as the unchangeable it is a universal, its individuality has in general the significance of all actuality. If consciousness were aware of being an independent consciousness, and the world of actuality were for it an absolute nullity, then in work and enjoyment it would attain to a feeling of its independence, since the world of actuality would be nullified by itself, but since this actuality is for consciousness the form of the unchangeable, it is unable of itself to nullify it. On the contrary, since it does not succeed in setting it at naught and enjoying it, this comes about through the unchangeable's itself having surrendered its embodied form and having relinquished it for the enjoyment of consciousness. Consciousness, on its part, likewise makes its appearance as an actuality, but also as divided within itself, and in its work and enjoyment, this dividedness displays itself as a breaking up into a relation to the world of actuality, or a being which is for itself, and into a being that is in itself. That relation to actuality is the changing of it, or working on it, the being for self which belongs to the individual consciousness as such, but in this relation it is also in itself or has intrinsic being. This aspect belongs to the unchangeable beyond and consists of faculties and powers, a gift from an alien source, which the unchangeable makes over to consciousness to make use of. Accordingly, consciousness in its activity is, in the first instance, a relationship of two extremes. On the one side, it stands as actively present, while confronting it as a passive actuality. The two sides are in relation with one another, but both have also withdrawn into the unchangeable and stand fast in themselves. It is therefore only a superficial element from each side that is involved in the moving interplay of their mutual opposition. The passive extreme of actuality is set aside by the active extreme, but the actuality on its side can only be set aside because its own unchangeable essence sets it aside, repels itself from itself, and hands over what is repelled to the active extreme. The active force appears as the power in which null actuality is dissolved. For this very reason, however, the consciousness to which the intrinsic or essential being, as another regards this power which it displays in its activity, to be the beyond of itself, instead, therefore, of returning from its activity back into itself, and having obtained confirmation of itself certainty, consciousness really reflects its activity back into the other extreme, which it then exhibited as a pure universal, as the absolute power from which the activity started in all directions, and which is the essence both of the self-dividing extremes as they had first appeared, and of their interchanging relationship itself. The fact that the unchangeable consciousness renounces and surrenders its embodied form, while on the other hand the particular individual consciousness gives thanks for the gift, that is, denies itself the satisfaction of being conscious of its independence, and assigns the essence of its action not to itself but to the beyond. Through these two moments of reciprocal self-surrender of both parts, consciousness does, of course, gain a sense of its unity with the unchangeable, but this unity is at the same time affected with a division, is again broken within itself, and from it there emerges once more the antithesis of the universal and the individual. For though consciousness renounces the show of satisfying its feeling of self, it obtains the actual satisfaction of it, for it has been desire, work, and enjoyment as concise as consciousness. It has willed, acted, and enjoyed. Similarly, even its giving of thanks, in which it acknowledges the other extreme as the essential being and counts itself nothing, is its own act which counterbalances the action of the other extreme, and meets the self-sacrificing beneficence with a like action. If the other extreme delivers over to consciousness only the surface of its being, yet consciousness also gives thanks, and it's in surrendering its own action, that is its essential being, it really does more than the other, which only sheds a superficial element of itself. Thus, the entire movement is reflected not only in the actual desiring, working, and enjoyment, but even in the very giving of thanks, where the reverse seems to take place, in the extreme of individuality. Consciousness feels itself therein as this particular individual, and does not let itself be deceived by its own seeming renunciation, for the truth of the matter is that it has not renounced itself. What has been brought about is only the double reflection into the two extremes, and the result is the renewed division into the opposed consciousness of the unchangeable and the consciousness of willing, performing, and enjoying, and self-renunciation itself, which confronts it, in other words, the consciousness of independent individuality in general. With this appears the third relationship of the process of this consciousness, which proceeds from the second as a consciousness that has truly proved itself to be independent by its will and its deed. In the first relationship, it was merely the notion of an actual consciousness, or the inner feeling or heart, which is not yet actual, in action and enjoyment. The second is this actualization as an external action and enjoyment. Returned from this external activity, however, consciousness has experienced itself as actual and effective, or knows that it is in truth and for itself. But here now is where the enemy is met with its most characteristic form. In the struggle of the heart and emotions of individual consciousness is only a musical abstract moment in work and enjoyment which makes this unsubstantial existence a reality. It can directly forget itself and the consciousness of its own particular role in this realization is cancelled out by the act of thankful acknowledgement, but this cancelling out is in truth a return of consciousness into itself, and moreover into itself as the actuality which it knows to be true. The third relationship, in which this true actuality is one of the extremes, This third relationship is in which the true actuality is one of the terms, is the relation of that actuality as a nothingness to a universal being. The process of this relation we have yet to consider. To begin with, as regards the contradictory relation in which consciousness takes its own reality to be immediately a nothingness, its actual doing thus becomes a doing of nothing. Its enjoyment of feeling of its wretchedness. Work and enjoyment thus lose all universal content and significance, for if they had any, they would have an absolute being of their own. Both withdraw into their mere particularity, which consciousness is set upon reducing to nothingness. Consciousness is aware of itself as this actual individual in the animal functions. These are no longer performed naturally and without embarrassment as matters trifling in themselves, which cannot possess any importance or essential significance for spirit. Instead, since it is in them that the enemy reveals himself in his characteristic shape, they are rather the object of serious endeavour, and become precisely matters of the utmost importance. This enemy, however, renews himself in his defeat, and consciousness, in fixing its attention on him, far from freeing itself from him, really remains forever in contact with him, and forever sees itself as defiled, and since at the same time this object of its efforts, instead of being something essential, is of the meanest character, instead of being a universal, is the merest particular, we have here only a personality confined in its own self and its own petty actions, a personality brooding over itself as wretched as it is impoverished. But to both of these moments, the feeling of its wretchedness and the poverty of its actions is linked the consciousness of its unity with the unchangeable, for the attempted direct destruction of what is actually is mediated by the thought of the unchangeable and takes place in this relation to it. The mediated relation constitutes the essence of the negative movement, in which consciousness turns against its particular individuality, but which, qua relation in itself, is in itself positive, and will bring consciousness itself to an awareness of its unity with the unchangeable. This mediated relation is thus a syllogism in which the individuality, initially fixed in its antithesis to the id itself, is united with this other extreme only through a third term. Through this middle term, the one extreme, the unchangeable, is brought into relation with the unessential consciousness, which equally is brought into relation with the unchangeable only through the middle term. Thus the middle term is one which presents the two extremes to one another and ministers to each in its dealings with the other. This middle term is itself a conscious being, the mediator, for it is an action which mediates consciousness as such. The content of this action is the extinction of its particular individuality which consciousness is undertaking. In the mediator, then, this consciousness frees itself from action and enjoyment, so far as they are regarded as its own. As a separate independent extreme, it rejects the essence of its will, and casts upon the mediator or minister, the priest, its own freedom of decision, and herewith the responsibility for its own action. This mediator, having a direct relationship with the unchangeable being, ministers by giving advice on what is right. The action, since it follows upon the decision of someone else, ceases, as regards the doing or the willing of it, to be its own, but there is still left to the unessential consciousness the objective aspect, namely the fruit of its labour and its enjoyment. These therefore it rejects as well, and just as it renounces its will, so it renounces the actuality it received in work and enjoyment. It renounces them partly as identified with the truth it has attained regarding its own self-conscious independence, inasmuch as what it does is foreign to it, a thinking and speaking of what is meaningless to it, partly as identified with external possessions, when it gives away a part of what it has acquired through work, and partly also as identified with the enjoyment it has had, when in its fastings and mortifications it once more completely denies itself that enjoyment. Through these moments of surrender, first of its right to decide for itself, then of its property and enjoyment, and finally through the positive moment of practicing what it does not understand, it truly and completely deprives itself of the consciousness of inner and outer freedom, of the actuality in which consciousness exists for itself. It has the certainty of having truly devoted itself to its I, and of having turned its immediate self-consciousness into a thing, into an objective existence. Only through this actual sacrifice could it demonstrate this self-renunciation, for only therein does the deception vanish which lies in the inner acknowledgement of gratitude through heart, sentiment and tongue, an acknowledgement which indeed disclaims all power pertaining to its own independent existence, ascribing it all to a gift from above, but which in this very disclaimer holds on to its own particular existence. Though so outwardly in the possessions, it does not surrender. Inwardly, in the consciousness of the decision it has itself made, and the consciousness of its content, which it has itself determined, which it has not exchanged for one coming from outside, which last would fill it up with what it is meaningless for it. But in the sacrifice actually carried out, consciousness, having nullified the action as its own doing, has also in principle obtained relief from its misery. That this relief has been obtained in principle is, however, the action of the other extreme of the syllogism, which is the essence possessed of intrinsic being, but that sacrifice made by the unessential extreme was at the same time not a one-sided action, but contained within itself the action of the other, for the surrender of one's own will is only from one aspect negative. Its principle, however, or in itself, it is at the same time positive, namely the positing of will as the will of another, and specifically of will not as a particular will, not as a particular, but as a universal will. This positive meaning of the negatively positive particular will is taken by this consciousness to be the will of the other extreme, the will which, precisely because it is an other for consciousness, becomes actual for it, not through the unhappy consciousness itself, but through a third, the mediator as counsellor. Hence, for consciousness, its will does indeed become universal and essential will, but consciousness itself does not take itself to be this essential will. The surrender of its own will as a particular will is not taken by it to be in principle the positive aspect of universal will. Similarly, its giving up of possessions and enjoyment has only the same negative meaning, and the universal which thereby comes to be for it is not regarded as its own doing. The unity of objectivity and being for self, which lies in the notion of action, and which therefore becomes a consciousness, essence and object, this unity is not the principle of its action, and so too it does not become an object for consciousness, directly and through itself. Rather, it lets the mediating minister express this certainty, a certainty which is itself still incomplete, that its misery is only in principle the reverse, that is, that its action brings it only in principle self-satisfaction or blessed enjoyment, that its pitiable action too is only in principle the reverse, namely an absolute action, that in principle action is only really action when it is the action of a particular individual. But for itself, action and its own actual doing remain pitiable, its enjoyment remains pain, and the overcoming of these in a positive sense remains a beyond. But in this object, in which it finds that its own action and being, as being that of this particular consciousness, are being and action in themselves, there has arisen for consciousness the idea of reason, of the certainty that, in its particular individuality, it has a being absolutely in itself, or is all reality.